what they were doing was rather a disagreeable thing. They were making a very bad weapon. Have a chain reaction which diverges and which can either be used for the generation of power or for the generation of explosives.
I've seen so many people come to the realization that Jeffrey was likely working as an intelligence operative for Mossad, and I think those of us who have been in this rabbit hole for a while figured that out a long time ago, but I'm seeing the conversation kind of end there. And I think there's a lot more to this conversation about who Jeffrey was working for. In the 80s, Jeffrey started his own private international intelligence firm where he would work with clients all over the globe and build connections based on the ones that he had already built at Bear Stearns, the Dalton School, and Towers Financial Group. And remember, he started this firm before he had even linked up with Les Wexner. During that time, he did not pledge loyalty to any one person, place, government, country, anything like that. He was solely loyal to himself and his own pockets. He worked all over the globe. Also keep in mind, at the time that he had started his own private intelligence firm, he was familiar with and aware of who Robert Maxwell was. As we learned from the birthday book, Robert Maxwell was a client of Bear Stearns way back in the 70s when Jeffrey was working there. And by the 70s, it was publicly known that Robert Maxwell was at least working for one country as an intelligence operative. We would later find out it to be 3. For a long time, a lot of people thought Robert Maxwell was simply Mossad, and it turned out he was Mossad, KGB, and also worked with the British intelligence services. And for a very long time, Robert Maxwell was extremely successful and extremely wealthy because of the work that he did. And I do wonder if Jeffrey saw him as kind of like the blueprint. So I'm going to tell you a couple of things that Robert Maxwell did, some examples of how he worked as a triple agent, and you can decide for yourself if you see similarities or patterns or mirroring between Robert Maxwell's career and some of Jeffrey's career. So Robert Maxwell built his connections with Soviet leadership, as well as blue and white state leadership, as well as British intelligence leadership, all within the same decade in the 40s. Robert Maxwell was a part of the Czechoslovakian army whenever the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia, modern-day Czech Republic and Slovakia. He then went on to join the British Armed Forces and worked his way up to the role of captain and was awarded a military cross for his heroism against the Germans. During the 1948 Nakba, Robert Maxwell called upon Czechoslovakian leadership as well as Soviet leadership to approve and begin sending weapons to the blue and white state to arm them throughout the Nakba. It has been cited that Robert Maxwell's influence was imperative in this decision making. During this time, Robert Maxwell also began facilitating the smuggling of aircraft parts to the blue and white state from Europe so that the blue and white state would be able to gain air supremacy in that area, in that region, which they did successfully. Skipping forward a little bit, in 1991, Robert Maxwell was involved in the coup, the failed coup of Mikhail Gorbachev, and this was shortly before Robert Maxwell passed away, literally months before. And throughout the coup, it was found out that Robert Maxwell had been passing information to all of the agencies and countries whom he was working with, which really ultimately just made the whole thing very messy. And coincidentally, just a few months after this failed coup, Robert Maxwell mysteriously passes away. After leaving the British Armed Forces, obviously we know that Robert Maxwell went on to start his many media companies and become this big media mogul, which we have talked about extensively. And also during this time, he got involved in British politics from 1964 to 1970, if I'm not mistaken. Robert Maxwell was an elected member of parliament representing the Labour Party. In the 80s, Robert Maxwell used his British connections to help Mossad kidnap and imprison a whistleblower. Mordecai Vanunu was a nuclear technician and peace activist in the blue and white state, and around 1986, he discovered that the blue and white state was not only building, but had a stockpile of nuclear weapons. As a peace activist, the best thing he felt he could do with this information was to tell it to the public, to someone who would listen, to someone who would not squash the story, because obviously if he was a whistleblower in the blue and white state, that story would get squashed or a lot worse. So Mordecai went to British media and whistleblew on the blue and white state that they were lying about having nuclear weapons. And guess who virtually owned all of British media at that time? Robert Maxwell. So Robert Maxwell took the information that Mordecai told to British media. He shared it with the Mossad, and the Mossad and him came up with a plan to have Mordecai kidnapped and taken back to the blue and white state. And that's exactly what happened. Mordecai was lured to Italy, where he was intercepted, drugged, and kidnapped by Mossad and taken back to the blue and white state, where he would spend the next 18 years in prison for being a traitor to the blue and white state, and 11 of those years would be spent in solitary confinement. Robert Maxwell also helped facilitate the sale of a Trojan horse version of the software Promis to the United States that was crafted and built by the blue and white state. Promis is basically a program that was created in the 70s to help courts and prosecutors keep track of cases, evidence, dates, etc. It's used frequently at the federal level, but the blue and white state created and marketed a Trojan horse version of Promis to be purchased by other countries, and this version allowed the blue and white state to virtually spy on everything the person who downloaded the software was doing. The specific sale of the Promis software from the blue and white state to the United States that was facilitated by Robert Maxwell happened to be highly consequential because the United States purchased this Promis software that was bugged for the two most important nuclear research facilities within the United States. Little did the United States know, the software was bugged and the blue and white state was allowed to spy on the top nuclear research facilities in the United States for an unknown amount of time. That's explained in very, very simplified terms of what like Promis is and stuff like that. And blue and white state is not the only country to do that with the Promis software. That's just a few examples of how Robert Maxwell was moving throughout his career. Our original question was Jeffrey Mossad? Absolutely. But is that all he was? Was he more of like a triple agent like Robert Maxwell? Or perhaps the destructive legacy of both of these men and what they were involved in show us that Mossad has infiltrated many more global intelligence agencies than we're aware of. Because the way these two men, in so many instances, like were pulling the puppet strings of like international ongoings as just two random people is so strange. The way they were so deeply involved, not in just one country's politics, they were so deeply involved in international politics. It's very eerie. Now, obviously, I don't know for sure if Jeffrey was like a triple agent, but I do believe he was either more than Mossad, or Mossad is much more powerful and much more infiltrated than we want to actually admit.